anybody can find this. It's on actually the CIA's website. They actually say that the thing they're most concerned about is that the public is gaining interest in ESP, which is leading to the proliferation of studies of ESP. And they think that that's the problem. As long as people aren't, they say, look, it's a pretty rare thing. There seems to be some really convincing evidence of this. But as long as people aren't studying it, then no one will ever develop it. And therefore, it won't be a hazard to us. And that's the long and short of this, 100-page long document.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think that the downplaying of it is perhaps the least expensive way for them to minimize their security threat. But the fact that they're interested in it is just like, wow, right? It's like, well, if any, as soon as the government's taking something seriously, especially the Defense Department.
So they basically recruited experts to look at the data. The experts look at the data and they say, okay, it looks good. And then the people in charge of the council overrule them, and when they put out the press release, completely contradict what the findings were.
Yes. So he clearly had his marching orders. Your job is to deflect interest from this. Why? Because at exactly the same time, it was right in the middle of the Stargate program. So there was a lot of effort being taken, that at least from a public perspective, to say there's nothing going on here. Like, why bother? Don't even look at it.
How good were the people that you saw in the Stargate program? You say that they were being able to, look through space and time and see things. How good were they relative to who you found since? Was there a significant difference in skill?
There are people today who have that level of skill. Maybe they're still working for the military, I don't know. I'm not in that program anymore. Tell us what's going on in that map coordinate. So I'll go look at that. So he goes look into that, goes into a building, goes inside a safe in the building, inside folders inside the safe, and gets some code words. And then reports that. That's what is reported, because this is like the most interesting stuff that he is seeing. So they report back to the contract monitor, who freaks out because, in fact, the code words are correct. And the only way that they could think that was happening was that it was a leak.
The idea that these sorts of personal details would get out into the open.
Business would radically change. Everything about government would radically change. Interpersonal relationships would change. So I think I tend to agree with you that a civilization that is fully telepathic, in principle, ought to be much more stable and probably open, and one would hope compassionate and all the rest, than where we currently are. Because a lot of it is driven by you don't know what is going on for somebody else.
Studies recently, I don't know if you've seen them, where they're devising neural networks to be able to reconstruct visual images off of brain patterns.
Yeah.
And so you see something and you're hooked up to, I actually haven't read closely enough what they're looking at. It might be EEG information, might be something more invasive, but they can actually roughly reconstruct the picture that you're looking at.
Yeah, it's from functional MRI. You give deep learning to even very complicated patterns, and if it's consistent enough, you can pick it out, right? Because those are classification tasks. Mm-hmm. Here we're talking about something much, much, much worse, because it's no longer brain-computer interface stuff. It is not connected to you at all. People at a distance. What makes it much worse is it would transcend time as well. So in a civilization that had this really, really well down, they somehow figured out how to do telepathy and remote viewing, future, past, and present. That means that both past and future crimes, very much like Philip K. Dick's story about Minority Report, that is a viability. I mean, I think that is actually possible.
This probably just goes to show how little I understand how this works amongst human beings, but it seems like it would be really emotionally sensitive people that would be good at this.
Sometimes you could be too emotionally sensitive, right? So if you're highly empathic, one of the things that could happen is you suppress it because you're getting buffeted constantly by other people's pain. And so you may be super psychic, but you'll never know it because you've pushed it down so far just to be able to live as a grounded human being. Because otherwise you end up with all kinds of disorders and simply trying to deal with it. What we do know then is, yes, there's some personality effects. some things like people who are engaged in creative living. So we're talking about artists, writers, dancers, musicians, tend to do a lot better than people who are not in those creative professions or creative outlets.
That's really interesting.
Complete speculation. Some people who end up very heavily drugged because of they're called schizophrenic or psychotic, they actually are natural psychics. They would do very well in a very controlled environment where they're not overstimulated. In this case, being not overstimulated is a little bit tricky because now this the entire universe, all throughout space and time, which could potentially be impinging on them. Of course, how do you shield from that? We have no idea how to shield. We don't know anything that blocks it. So no wonder they go crazy after a while. They can't turn it off. But that's like full blown. But you take somebody who's like pretty high up on the schizotypy scale, not full blown psychotic, but also like creative artist plus a little more. We're really open to these things, but still have enough control to be able to turn it on and off. And it turns out that in a sense, is the true experts that we can find. They can go into some space, it just blasts in there. And by the way, it's not like their mind is going out and looking around and everything. It comes in, boom, it's all there. And so the training, remote viewing training, is to figure out, once you have this flash of a huge amount of information, how do you decompose it? How do you pull it apart to try to make any sense of it? That takes a lot of training.
It's the perennial problem with psychedelic experiences too, is that people have a really hard time bringing their acquired wisdom back to the real world.
Yeah.
But by the way, I love the image, or I love the definition of artist as schizo-adjacent. That checks out. And
yeah, I can talk about collective consciousness studies, which is common in musical groups and choral groups and things like that. Yeah, it happens. And in that case, it's happening without psychedelics. So, at least what we're learning now in hyperscanning studies, when people are engaged in the same task, that their brains go in sync if they are actually engaged in the same task. So if you have two people or more than two people watching the same video, their brains will go into sync. And you can tell who's not in sync because their bodies are not showing the same synchronization. So this is way back in graduate school, I got interested in body synchrony. And you could tell by taking a video of people sitting around a table of who was paying attention to what was going on by whether or not their bodies were swaying in synchrony. And so we all are familiar with, even on Zoom, you see this sometimes, that there's a bunch of people out there and one of them then takes a drink, or one of them moves slightly, or one of them does something. Everyone will do it at exactly the same time. Well, why? Why does that happen? It happens in person more often because there's more sensory information coming in, but that level of synchrony is happening constantly. And that's how you can tell when somebody's not paying attention, because they're moving to some other thing going on in their own head or somewhere else. Yeah, we know these effects are real. They tend to be really tiny in the laboratory, but we have very high confidence that they're also real. Will that ever turn into very pragmatic things? And so I say, yes, it potentially can do that, but the civilization that we would have at that point would look so different from what we have today that you would not recognize it at all. Totally different, completely different justice system. It would be like, it wouldn't have any comparison to what we see today. You may not even need police anymore. You don't need any of that apparatus. And business and everything else, politics would be totally different. Just imagine now the way politics go, where there's alternative facts.
It might be on an evolutionary timescale, but I'm intrigued by the possibility that it could happen very quickly also.
But we know that social taboos can collapse quickly. It appears to collapse quickly, even though behind it has been an enormous amount of pressure for a long period of time. So it does seem to be something like a step function. There's a lot of pressure and pressure and pressure, and then some criterion is reached, and boom, it flips into the other direction. So that, yes, that can happen. It may happen in this case too.
I hope so.
I co-founded a genetic neuroengineering company. So we can do with an intranasal spray, we can do either CRISPR or RNA interference methods, and change receptors We can downregulate, we can silence receptors in your brain very precisely, including cocktails, which we haven't developed cocktails yet. We're just targeting like 5-HT2A. We can turn that off. We can do it temporarily, we can do it permanently. And we're pretty sure at this point that if we found that, I don't know, a half a dozen receptors tweaked in just the right way would put you into that state after what feels like after meditating for 8 hours, for 10 days, we could probably put you into that. The problem is we can't get you out very quickly. You know, when you start monkeying around with receptors, you're talking about changing proteins in the brain. So we can do that. We're targeting things like dementia and Alzheimer's, because we know by twiddling certain receptors you can significantly improve memory. And we've shown that in mice and rats. So we figured, yes, someday there will be a nasal spray, probably with RNAi or some other faster acting genetic edit that will make you super psychic for a couple of weeks before it wears off. People will sometimes say, I'm involved in the paranormal. What does that even mean? It's like everything you've ever seen on the X-Files is the paranormal. It's all weird stuff gets shoveled into one bin. And so I make a distinction. The psi research is very different because it is completely amenable to scientific study in the laboratory under controlled conditions and has been for the last 150 years. So we can gain certain degrees of confidence with it that we can't do so well with Bigfoot, because he won't come into the laboratory. And of I've seen bits and pieces of evidence now and then that look kind of interesting, but if it's only anecdotal, or in some respects, even like what we see with UFOs, there's some intriguing stuff out there. But at least to gain high confidence that something's real, it has to be independently repeatable. You want to get it under some type of control, even if it's a very small magnitude effect. We know these effects are real. They tend to be really tiny in the laboratory, but we have very high confidence that they're also real. Will that ever turn into very pragmatic things? And so I say, yes, it potentially can do that. But the civilization that we would have at that point would look so different from what we have today that you would not recognize it at all.